Hello, Megan. Can you hear me here? You can? Okay. All righty. Well, I'm excited to be able to debate you on this. This is actually a really interesting topic, and I'm glad that you had suggested something similar to, I think you said neoliberalism. It's like, well, I mean, classical liberalism versus progressive liberalism is a perfect conflict of ideas, and they're both useful in their own light. So let me talk about where I see classical liberalism as being advantageous. Now, first of all, let me define what I see the difference as being. So classical liberalism primarily focuses on freedom, on giving each individual an increased amount of freedom when possible. It was developed because of monarchies and dictatorships, and in order to fight that, it came up with the idea of giving individuals more freedom to run their own lives. Whereas progressive liberalism is also focused on those individuals, but it is focused on the less fortunate individuals, the ones who cannot provide for themselves. Now, I believe this is where the differentiation is, but feel free to disagree if you see a different one. Now, for me, and I believe that most governments should be looking at as a primary value, as a primary goal, the prosperity and quality of life of their citizens. Because when that is best afforded to the citizens, their citizens have the best opportunity, which would mean it is the best form of nation. So with that being said, there are three things that I think that set apart classical liberalism from progressive liberalism, making it better. So the first one is that decentralization is preferable to centralization. In a classical liberal philosophy, you enable each individual more power over their own lives. With centralization, it is one overall governing body, and each individual, even if it's democracy, doesn't have that much say in what actually happens to them. But if you give it through localized government or decentralized governments, each individual has more of a say, more of a power in how their own lives are being run, which is hugely advantageous to those individuals. The second advantage I see is that of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. With equality of opportunity, you enable each individual to make decisions for themselves. You give them each the opportunity to add value to the market or whatever type of value that they see, as opposed to equality of outcome where you control what they must do. This gives more power to each individual to run their own life. The third advantage I see is that of a marketplace of ideas. When you enable each individual to have freedom, each person can add to that market, especially in free speech. Discussions like this wouldn't be able to happen if we were controlling it and saying only one type of thought is possible. By enabling each individual, we benefit people through investment, through technology, and through the freedom of speech.
First of all, am I being heard? Is this cool? Okay, excellent. So interesting. I guess there's a few things that it relates to right there really quickly. I guess there's nothing in progressivism that says that it can't be done on a state or local level. So I think that's what my first argument would come to, because it does seem that classical liberalism does quickly want to address, oh, I can't do this on a local level. And progressivism doesn't say you can't do that. It tends to be seen and noticed most often on the federal largest level because that makes the most sweeping change. But as a key tenet of progressivism, it's not said there anywhere. As long as you're still fighting for the same rights for everyone anyway. I thought it was interesting you brought up democracy, honestly, because I do feel that progressivism just wants to use democracy in everyone's interests, and classical liberalism doesn't really allow democracy to work the way it's meant to work on its own. I feel like if you really want to support classical liberalism, you don't actually support democracy, because it's accepting sometimes you won't always get your way when you accept that you're okay with a vote deciding how things are going to go. Which is, I guess, a separate argument still, that, okay, if you don't like the way democracy runs things, then that's fine. But the reason I say, I mean, the title of this debate uses the word preferable, not like it's the best system or the only system. The reason I think progressivism is preferable is because we do live in a democracy, and that does allow people to decide what they think is better. And if you do not like the way 51% of the country votes on something and you're in that 49% that didn't, there is always kind of next time around, there are ways in the democratic system to change it. And progressives tend to really utilize that avenue as much as possible, to use democracy to their advantage, to say everyone should be doing this, why don't you? They try to convince everyone it's the right thing to do. And so you can sit there and say, sure, everyone shouldn't be forced to do this, but if 60% of the people agree, but I still want to do this because it's the right thing to do and progressive thought, and 40% say, well, I don't want to do that, they still accept the outcome of democracy as it is to say, I'm going to do it if everyone else says so, though. Which is why I see those arguments as kind of intertwined. If you don't like democracy, that is a separate argument, though, because I guess I can't argue with that in this frame. That's okay if you don't like it. That's a separate thing. But in this country, I see that's the only way really that it makes sense to keep going, because if we're going to sit here and say, oh, well, I don't like having to listen to what other people want me to do just because that's not my preferred way of going, then you don't actually support democracy, because that's how we've all agreed to kind of work. I hope that makes sense.
To a certain extent, it does. I think both of your points that you presented there sort of tie into the same thing. You talk about how progressivism can happen at a state and local level, and then you go on to talk about how progressivism is more democratic. I believe is that summarizing more democratic? Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't really see how it would be more democratic, in that the whole point of classical liberalism is to enable the liberty of each individual, which happens through democracy, typically. I mean, it could happen in multiple ways, but when you enable each person the freedom to run their life, the reason that I mention state and local governance, let's use healthcare as an example. With healthcare, obviously there's a lot of debate about healthcare right now. I would advocate for healthcare and other social safety nets to be provided at a state or local level, because there are multiple different ways to go about it. There are multiple different types of plans. My dad actually sells health insurance, so he talks about that all the time. But there are so many different ways you could set it up, and a lot of the time it will be dependent on the individual in their community. So there are different types of plans that would work in different communities. So if you decide that progressive ideals must happen, you could vote for that in a local community. If that is best for you and your community, I agree, you can do that. But the whole point of a classical liberal system would be that you decentralize it so that it only happens in that community. So if you want to vote for a socialized version of healthcare in California, you'd have that ability, but it wouldn't force it on the people in Alabama. If we do it at a federal level, then you are saying that whatever is passed at a federal level will affect the people in Alabama and the people in California. So the difference in the two philosophies, as I see it, is that one of them is enabling each community the freedom to choose as they wish, whereas the other seems to be saying, this is the answer, we're going to make this be the answer. Do you see it differently?
I do a little bit, because I think it relies on the idea. Okay, I mean, the California healthcare argument, that seems nice and local, but I'm sure all the many conservative farmers out in California would not really much like having socialized healthcare going on. So then just how local should it be for it to be an okay thing to do? So that's why there is an argument for socialized healthcare on the federal level, because then at least you can have this kind of baseline in place for every other state to then go up or down as needed to. I guess it could only really go up, but still. And I think it's very similar when you actually consider the minimum wage argument. I think it's actually a little bit easier to think about in terms of locally, maybe, to continue this argument, because, for instance, a progressive ideal that's touted around in America, hand waved around, is the $15 minimum wage. And I consider myself a progressive without personally supporting the $15 minimum wage across a federal level thing. I think that's an okay thing to do. People are free to let me know if I'm a wrong progressive for that. That's because I am personally from Florida, and that's where it wouldn't economically make sense to have a $15 minimum wage. That's just not the level that's needed. But I'm still a progressive fighting for a higher minimum wage in Florida, that whatever it would be, whatever $15 is in California or New York is what it needs to be equivalently in Florida, even if it's not actually $15 based on the different standards of living in each state. And there would still be so many people in Florida who disagree with me, saying, oh, but markets this, but price raising that, but employment that you could still argue then that's not small enough of a community to make that kind of change. That's why some cities change their minimum wage. And then even still, what do you do if you live in a city you don't support that, and that's where people vote around you? So to kind of use that argument of saying, oh, well, it's okay if it's locally, I think it's a kind of slippery slope, because you're never going to win. There's always going to be someone in a community who disagrees with you. And if you really think anything should be done in a just way, or support general progress occurring, even if you think it shouldn't be done all on one sweeping thing, then you're always going to let someone down, and classic liberalism will not be on your side, and because society won't be on your side. I hope that makes sense. What I'm getting at here is that progressivism just fights for what's right in the democratic way, and classical liberalism kind of throws its hands in the air and says, oh, it's never going to happen unless we all just decide on it, and you're never going to get that 100% consensus.
Well, I wouldn't say that classical liberalism throws its hands in the air and says, go for it. I think the whole point of enabling people freedom is that there are so many different skills that each individual has. When you control an economy, you say, this is the outcome you must have. This is the answer it's going to be at in the long term. But when you enable an economy to be on its own, each individual has the opportunity to add their own specific value to that market. For instance, an inventor would be encouraged to share their invention. An investor would be encouraged to invest in that invention because it benefits each of them. When each individual uses their own specific skills, that creates a benefit for the rest of the world. And in fact, we actually see this. Over the last 30 years, the World Bank has estimated that 50% of those who were in extreme poverty have been taken out of extreme poverty as a direct result of increased globalization, trade, and investment. This is not to say that we're perfect. I agree with you that there are absolutely social issues that we see in the world. There are problems that people face. But at the same time, the end goal is to help the most amount of people as we can. And I'm not saying that classical liberalism or social progressive liberalism will be perfect. There is no perfect system. But at the same time, we have seen specific results from classical liberalism, from the idea of enabling each individual to add value. Because when they do so, it helps the most amount of people. Now, you asked the question of how local should it be? When should we be using progressive ideals? Now, there's a little bit of a contradiction that I see in your question, in that what I'm saying here is not that, or how do I phrase this actually? If we put something at a federal level, then everyone is going to have to deal with it. If we do something in each 50 states, you're right that there will be some people who probably won't be happy with it. But you've still given more of an opportunity for people to control their own life. In America, we have states, which is simply the reason I would say do it at a state level. But in any place, you could do it simply at a local level. If you focus on localities and allow them to make these decisions for themselves, more power to the people is simply the goal that I'm going for here. Enable each individual to control their own life, control their own body. You don't support the $15 minimum wage in your state. And I think that's a good example of what I'm going for here. I agree with you that we should be able to make those sorts of decisions in each of our states. I am saying that progressive thought may not necessarily be bad. There are certain times when I think it's advantageous, especially if you have a community.
I think I got what you meant. Is it okay if I pass it back so you can finish your thought? Actually, I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Okay. What was I saying? I think I was saying that progressive thought is not necessarily bad. And I think that there's a lot of good things that are included in it. And actually, let me just say this. Penn Jillette is one of my favorite thinkers. He's Penn Jillette, the Penn and Teller, the magician. He's also a philosopher. And one of the things he says is that when it comes to these questions, he does not believe he is capable of making decisions for someone else's life. He doesn't know how to do their healthcare. He doesn't know how to do their welfare. He doesn't know how to do that. And so he says, when I have the opportunity, I want to ask the question first, could we solve this with more freedom? So by what I'm advocating here is how do we give each individual person more freedom? And if they can't solve it on their own, that's when you might need a social safety net. But the first goal should not be safety net. The first goal, in my opinion, should be, how do we solve this by giving the individual the opportunity to do it?
And this is where we kind of return again to the title of the argument being what's preferable. I mean, the argument of, well, how much can we do before we step in is, I think it ends more shortly than we all wish it did. I think it necessitates kind of intervention from some governing level, no matter what level we are looking at, to make it actually happen. In fact, that is what really bred progressivism in the first place, was such levels of extreme poverty, where it's saying, this is no longer something that I can just grab myself up from the bootstraps and fix anymore. I do need that safety net. And that still continues today with the minimum wage argument. That still continues today with the healthcare argument, where sure, someone might not know exactly what my needs are, what anyone else's needs are, but can we all agree on a baseline that would protect us all, and then we can build up from there. And that goes back all the way, honestly, to I really do hate to refer to this argument, but even like the Civil War and fighting for states' rights and slavery, because the quick argument is, oh, it was about states' rights, and sure, that was true, but states' rights to do what? Well, primarily to own slaves. And there was an economic argument for why they wanted to own slaves. And of course, the Civil War was more about keeping the Union. We all know that, but it only happened because of this kind of root thing at the beginning having to do with slavery. And at the end of the day, do we really care more about the economic necessity of having slaves to keep the South's economy going, or do we care more about the freedom of the people? And that's one of the instances where I do recognize that freedom is still kind of the answer, even if it was done via regulation, which is a kind of unique instance. Civil rights in the 60s kind of has a very similar frame to it, though, where we needed to have regulation to tell people how to act morally in order to give other people more freedom to live their lives. And that's still, especially in libertarian circles, a huge controversy today, of saying, sure, technically that's what you and me agree is the moral thing to do, but who am I to tell a private business owner how they should be operating their business? And then the progressive argument to that is saying, oh, I'm very much the person to tell them how to operate their business because they're restricting someone else's freedom when they don't do so. And that is one of the core tenets of our Constitution in this country, is providing everyone that basic standard of well-being and welfare, is making sure that they can enjoy their life to the best of their ability as anyone else. I think what you mentioned earlier with opportunity is more achieved by progressivism than classical liberalism, because it's really fighting for people at the core and saying, we recognize that there's a greater good here that needs to be achieved, and we're not going to wait for it. That's my thought.
So you think that opportunity is more achieved by a planned economy? Because I would think that, or by a planned government, I would think that would result in equality of outcome. You're saying that this is how it's going to be. Everyone will be equal in this way. Like, for instance, socialism, you would say everyone will have this benchmark. Everyone will receive, say, $40,000. As opposed to equality of opportunity, which says there is no benchmark, there's no specific number, but each of you will have the opportunity to potentially go higher than 40,000, and you might fall lower. And if you do fall lower, the classical liberal thought would incorporate a social safety net for those who fall lower. But at the same time, the goal would be to have each person have the opportunity to rise above 40,000, or whatever benchmark it would be. Now, you asked what is preferable, and you talk about how do we solve extreme poverty. Well, I actually have two responses to this. The first is that we already know what solves extreme poverty, because we've been doing it recently. Like I said in my last thing that I was talking about, 50% of those who were in extreme poverty 30 years ago have been taken out of extreme poverty. I understand that the goal of what you're going for is to help those who are in extreme poverty, but we already know that the best way to do that is to encourage others to be able to hire them. When you create an opportunity for each individual to add value to the market, they are incentivized to do so. And obviously, some people are going to slip through the cracks. And that I'm not saying this is a perfect system, but we do know that we have seen an incredible amount of people who have been bettered by an increased globalistic system, by this ability to have free trade, by increased innovation between markets, between countries. And as it continues, and as we continue to share, we continue to create new jobs and new opportunities for each person. And so my second response to you is simply, I know what your goal is, but do you have an example of your system working? Where exactly have we benefited the most amount of people, taken the most amount of people out of extreme poverty through your type of system? And the last thing you talked about was an economic necessity, like, for instance, slavery. Now, my answer to this would be that obviously there is a time when government is necessary. I think it should be limited. And so the phrase that I have often heard used is, your right to swing your fist ends when it hits my face. So you should have the ability to swing your fist. You should be able to do what you want until you hurt someone else. And that's when it is necessary to have a government step in to protect each individual's life, liberty, and property, so that each of them will have the opportunity to make these decisions for themselves.
And it sounds like what you just brought up is the non-aggression pact. And I have a few words to say on that. I'll try not to get too deep into it. I'm going to try to retrace what was just talked about. The first, incentivizing the escape from poverty, and then kind of what is an example of my system working. I'll try not to go to Bernie Sanders on you and talk about all the Scandinavian countries, because I get it, it's annoying, but that is a quick example. So I just want to throw it out there that it does happen there. There are lots of reasons why it works there and it wouldn't work here. I do understand that. But technically, that is an example that answers your question. I would then otherwise answer your question by saying there aren't a whole lot of examples, because this isn't something that has been really easily tried. However, you can quickly point to FDR era politics. And again, I'm not saying that was a perfect era, but that was definitely a time in which we did see things improve with the New Deal. And that was, I guess, a perfect example that, like, people like Bernie tried to kind of reignite in people in the last year. I would quickly point most recently to Seattle raising its minimum wage and not seeing any problems with unemployment, not seeing any problems with prices raising, but instead just seeing people actually just have more income in the lowest classes, and thus having more spending money, and that's helping their economy. So it usually is best seen on the most local of levels, in which people are actually able to achieve these progressive goals without the most backlash. Regarding the non-aggression pact, I have gotten into many arguments in this where I think it really depends on what you define as aggression, because I really do see healthcare and one's refusal to pay for healthcare for other people as aggression. And more people see it more physically as like I want, like, only if I specifically do an actual action to you is that aggression. But I say, if you have the ability to stop me from dying and you don't do that, your choice was the action, that choice was the aggression. And it goes in a lot more ways than just healthcare. It goes a lot more ways than even that, than just life-saving. It goes into defending everyone's right to education, because that is what gets you out of that poverty. You talk about incentivizing escape from poverty, and it's not just a free market that has done that. In fact, I don't actually know what stat you're referring to, the 50% less in poverty. I don't know if that's just with respect to America or what time frame, because that does matter. I would argue, well, was it also opportunities to education that helped that? Was it also desegregation education that helped that? Was that just a stronger higher education availability or something like that? Was it actually wages rising that allowed that to happen as people were able to grow in their jobs? There's a lot more questions than just, I don't think that the free market can answer all the questions of why poverty has gotten better. And the fact that there's so much left to do is why I think we need to take that next step of progressivism.
So first you talked about Scandinavian countries. Now, it's actually interesting. I have a different response than I've heard from a lot of people about Scandinavian countries. If you look at the Human Freedom Index provided by either the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute, obviously those are both right of center, but you can take a look at them because the reason they're doing it is to question the amount of freedom in each nation. The Economic Freedom Index in each of the Scandinavian nations ranks them as each more economically free than America. The only way in which the Scandinavian nations are more progressive is that they have a higher social safety net. So in that, I see your point. But at the same time, part of the reason why they are successful is because they actually do enable a more capitalist form of an economy than America does. And that's part of the reason they've actually been successful recently. You can take a look at that. They actually, their regulations on businesses are lower than what we have in America. So I understand where you're going with that. But at the same time, I think your example is part of what I'm saying, in that when you enable each business to hire more people, when you don't tax them as much, when you don't regulate them as much, it gives them the opportunity to hire others. It also frees up more capital that they can invest into another business. I love watching the show Shark Tank, for instance, because this is how it works. There are these fantastic ideas that we can use to benefit society. And what needs to happen for that is people just need money to be able to make it happen. And so when you enable each individual to do that, we are able to help so many in society. Now, you asked about the 50% number. It's from the World Bank. And I don't know if the World Bank specifically linked it to globalism and increased trade, but I know that humanprogress.org, which is a project of the Cato Institute, and I know obviously a libertarian organization, but they did specifically link it to that, and you can look at their numbers on that. Maybe it's not entirely, we can't say it's entirely based on that. I'm sure that education, of course, has a huge part to do with that. But what you can see is that a huge amount of it is coming from increased incentive to invest in others, from this increased ability to trade with others. Because when we open up the markets to that, more people are benefited. And that's why I advocate for this. It's not based on a moral sort of thing. It's not like people just inherently deserve it. It's simply that it's the best system that we have seen so far. You said that there aren't a lot of examples so far of your system. I would ask, is the reason for that human nature? What is the reason why we don't see a lot of examples of progressivism so far?
I would quickly respond that is the reason for America's failure so far in many different ways, also a response of human nature, in that we've been following classical liberalism until very recently. I think that it's very clear that some things just aren't working after 250 years, at least not how they should be by 2017. So I would not say human nature is against progressivism. I would just say it's taken us a while to get there because humans evolve and learn, and that's okay. I would also argue very quickly that progressivism isn't inherently meaning more regulations. It means doing what you have to do to make the right thing happen, which can include more regulations. That's where I would point back to the Scandinavian countries and the successes they do have, because progressivism is not inherently anti-capitalist. That's a separate argument. This is strictly about American progressivism, in my opinion, at least. That's what I intended for this argument. And I don't consider that to be anti-capitalist. So sure, it can work out that you fight for those social goals and those social regulations and still have a free market work out. You can still have some regulations on businesses and then not regulate every single little area, hoping the free market works itself out. Also, in defense of the Scandinavian countries, they are a lot smaller and have smaller populations to work with and more uniform countries to work with. So it just kind of works a little bit differently. So no, I would not say I think on our American level that it's against human nature. I think there is certainly in American culture a notion of we have I don't want to say superior, but almost superior culture. People think culturally that that's what makes us America. That's what makes us great, is who we are from our very core of our history, is that we can build ourselves up from scratch and make everything better. And I think it's hard to get rid of that part of your human nature of wanting to believe, yes, I can do this on my own and yes, I can grow. But it's sure a lot easier to think that when you're already in an okay place, when you already have the power in the country and control the power structures that puts everyone else down. I would say that if you were to speak to the poorest of the poor or the most oppressed of the minorities and ask them how they feel about that, is it just human nature to keep them down? They would say, well, I don't think so. If I had any say in it, I would make it better, but I'm not a senator and I have all these voting barriers to keep me from going to the polls. And, oh, my kid's, the best school is miles away, so my kid has to go to the worst school in the area, so he can't get much better. It's all of these things that keep people down that progressives really fight for. If it has to be done by the government, then so be it, because other than that, we're not going to get anywhere just depending on the best of human nature to work out.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of quickly here, but you talked about how because the Scandinavian countries are smaller, they work better, that the idea of social progressivism works better over there. But I do agree with this. That's part of the reason why I've advocated for decentralization, that the whole idea of the way that America was set up, with the constitutional setup, with the states, is that each individual state should be able to decide for itself. Because it's smaller, because it's decentralized, you can allow them to make those sorts of decisions. If you wanted progressive ideals, I would simply advocate that you do it at those state levels. You also talked about how American progressivism is what you're advocating for. I'm going to ask you to define that because I only have about 3 minutes. I'm going to finish at 3 minutes here. But if you could define what your specific version is. You also talked about how we're keeping people down. Well, I don't actually think we're keeping people down. There are certain elements of society that are keeping people down. And part of that is crony capitalism, which is the same as crony socialism. And I would advocate against that sort of thing. When government benefits big business, that's absolutely something that we should be pushing against. But regular freedom does not keep people down. It gives them an ability, an incentive to bring themselves up, especially if there is a social safety net to protect them if something goes wrong. And then the one other thing you said that I want to talk about is you said that some things aren't working after 250 years, so we have to do something about them. But America is one of the, actually at this point, is the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. That is working. There are some people who are being hurt, but overall, it is beneficial. At the same time, we've seen over the last 30 years, around the whole world, it wasn't just America, but around the whole world, 50% of those in extreme poverty have been raised out of extreme poverty. Nobody's saying the system is perfect, but after 250 years, it seems to be doing a lot better than anything we've ever had before.
One of the biggest things that did happen in around the last 50 years, it was a little bit longer than that, of course, was the New Deal. So I will say that that may have played a big part of it. I think, once again, we get back to that issue of progressivism on state levels still counts as progressivism. So I don't see why the Scandinavian argument can't still kind of apply. I know it's not perfect, but I think that would still apply. It really sounds to me like you asked me to define American progressivism, and American progressivism, by what I believe is my definition, but what I believe is also kind of the overarching definition, is just a fight for, like you said, it tends to focus on the lowest at the system of the power system, and that is for a reason, because it's really for everyone, but then to help everyone out, you have to help out the ones at the lowest the most, and that is done however it needs to be done. If it's done by regulation, then so be it. If it's done by just protesting in the streets to get everyone to realize being racist is bad, then sure, that's how we do it. But it's all those fights for just justice and equality. It's all those fights to make sure everyone has opportunity to success. And it goes back to that kind of argument before you're mentioning about freedom to opportunity or freedom to outcome. What's $40,000? That whole argument. Opportunity is, or money rather, that outcome you keep referring to, is kind of the new opportunity at the same time. It's really not as easy anymore as it once was to try and get to that 40,000 level necessary basic limit by starting out with nothing. There's no opportunity to get that without having some money, like you mentioned on Shark Tank alone. You need that money to make money. You also referred to regular freedom and how those things can help out. I think regular freedom is really achieved through progressivism. And I don't think you disagree with me. It really sounds like you overall agree with the ideals of progressivism as a whole, and that you may be kind of stuck in the notion that it's just too controlling for you to really agree with it, for you to really side with it. And I would quickly argue that I just don't think that's the case. I think it's really trying to convince people that it's not controlling, this is the right thing to do, and we can do this together to help people out. And if some people still disagree with it, then we're back to that democracy argument of, okay, well then sure, go ahead and vote for it. And if you lose, you lose. Then the state is not the state for you, or that country isn't the country for you, if that's how much you oppose it. Or just try again next time. Like, I welcome you to fight your democratic goal, and then I will once again try to convince you that the right way to be is this line of thought in progressivism. That's what we're arguing here. I think that classic liberalism tries to put itself on a pedestal for being for freedom, when it really just leaves people behind, because the true way to fight for freedom is to go for the collective effort to make sure everyone is being taken care of.
To a certain extent, I understand what you'd be saying there. But the whole point of freedom is the ability to make decisions for yourself. And if there is an overarching entity that is telling you what you must do, that is the opposite of freedom. That's not freedom at all. You might be enabling people to have more capital. They might get more money because government is giving them money. But that's not freedom. You can advocate for that, but that's different than freedom. There's an overall mindset difference that I think the two of us have. You say that I support progressive ideals. Not necessarily. I support people's freedom to believe in progressive ideals. I don't necessarily believe in them myself. which I think is the difference there. I do not want to make decisions for someone else's life as much as I can. I want to protect people's lives. I want to make sure that if someone is hurting them, we defend them as much as we can. Protect their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as it were. But the difference is, I do not take it upon myself to believe I can make decisions for them. I want them to be able to make decisions on their own healthcare. I want them to be able to make decisions on their own welfare, on their own ability to have businesses. And I think that the major difference between the two sides is simply that with a classical version of liberalism, it is focused on incentivizing everyone, on giving each person the freedom to come up with their own individual answers to things. Whereas your version is specifically focused on the poor, which is admirable, and I think it's understandable and should be done. But the mindset difference is, if we focus specifically on the poor and try and bring them up, it does not encourage the innovation and the investment that is what actually takes them out of poverty in the first place. Just giving someone money is different than enabling them to have a job, enabling them to have these decisions. And I think that's the real difference there. If you use force, it is different than if you enable an equal opportunity and equal decision for each person. And so I'm at 20 seconds. I think I'm just going to finish mine right here. I think that the major difference between the two of us is both of us want to help the individual, but I see the way as helping them. And I think that society, the last 30 years have shown, it is best accomplished by enabling them freedom.
I think it is best accomplished by enabling them freedom via progressive values. I think that progressivism is what fights for those freedom for those who need it the most, first and foremost, and then it equalizes out to everyone. You mentioned protect them from being hurt, but they are being hurt by more ways than just physical attacks. They are being hurt in the democratic system in which they cannot get out to vote. They are being hurt by not having access to education. They are being hurt by having lower paying jobs than what they should be given. The very basic issue with the minimum wage and it needing to be raised is a core progressive thing that's kind of a separate argument, but it still stands where people argue, oh, the market will take care of it, and yet it clearly hasn't. People are still stuck with the low-paying jobs that don't pay the bills for them, and they can't even get a promotion in their own job, have to work 3 or 4 minimum wage jobs just to pay the bills for their families. Those issues are where we need to provide those opportunities there by saying the realm that which you are stuck in right now as someone in poverty, you're not going to be allowed out because there's a strong cycle of poverty in America that, except for extreme circumstances in which you are able to get yourself out, whether by luck and uniquely hard work and all these great things that sure we can look at and admire all the time, but we should not beat people down for not being able to work 4 jobs a week while having kids and taking them to school and being a single parent. Those little things are where we have to protect Americans and recognize extreme situations do occur, and they happen more often than we think, and we need to take care of them. I really think that it's not just about giving them money. That's not what it's about. It is about giving them education. It is about making sure they have access to as much education as they need to succeed. And that's a very progressive ideal that relates very much to the government. It doesn't really have to either. I think the government should be providing as strong of a baseline education as possible to make everyone have at least a baseline available. There can be other opportunities for education available. I'm not saying shut down private schools, shut down charter schools, shut down homeschooling, but at least the government should be offering that so that everyone gets that equal opportunity. I think education is in fact the most basic equal opportunity that needs to be perfected, because that really puts everyone on equal footing from then on. And then furthermore, I think voting and democracy is like a surprisingly progressive issue where we have to really fight for everyone to have equal access to the ballot and equal opportunity to go vote and equal education to know what they're voting on. And that is, for some reason, a progressive ideal that actually helps put everything together. I just really don't see how these things can be just said, oh, it'll work itself out because freedom is still what's best, when we need to do more than just that.